Most people say they want to grow. They want to improve at work, become better partners, lead more effectively, communicate more clearly, and understand themselves more honestly. But growth depends on information, and some of the most important information about who we are does not come from inside us. It comes from other people. It comes in the form of reactions, observations, criticism, guidance, praise, and difficult truths about how we come across or how our actions affect others. In theory, that sounds valuable. In practice, it often feels terrible. A comment from a boss can replay in the mind all day. A small criticism from a partner can feel much larger than it logically should. Advice from a friend can feel intrusive, and even useful coaching can arrive wrapped in embarrassment or defensiveness. Thanks for the Feedback is a book about that experience. It is not mainly about how to give feedback better. It is about what happens when you are the one receiving it. The authors argue that this is one of the most overlooked and important human skills. If you cannot take in information about yourself, then your ability to learn remains narrow. But if you take in every comment uncritically, you may become confused, discouraged, or overly shaped by other people's opinions. So the challenge is not simple acceptance. The challenge is wiser reception. This book helps explain why feedback is so hard to hear, why we resist it in predictable ways, and how we can become more skillful at sorting what is useful from what is incomplete, unfair, or badly delivered. It treats the receiving side of communication as an active, intelligent process. And that makes the book both practical and surprisingly humane. One of the most illuminating ideas in the book is that the word feedback is far too broad for the experiences it tries to contain. We often use it as though it names a single category, but the authors argue that what we call feedback is actually made up of 3 different kinds of input: appreciation, coaching, and evaluation. Appreciation says, I see your effort, I value what you contribute, and what you do matters. Coaching says, here is how you could improve, adjust, or grow. Evaluation says, here is where you stand according to a standard, expectation, or judgment. These 3 forms of input feel different because they serve different human needs. Appreciation nourishes motivation and belonging. Coaching helps development. Evaluation provides ranking, consequence, and orientation. Many feedback problems begin not because people are oversensitive, but because these categories are mixed together or confused. Someone who needs appreciation may receive only coaching and feel unseen. Someone who needs clear evaluation may receive vague encouragement and feel unanchored. Someone who believes they are being coached may actually hear a judgment about their worth or competence. Once you understand this distinction, many interactions become easier to interpret. A manager who says, "Good work overall, but next time be more concise," may imagine they are balancing praise and coaching. The employee, however, may hear the criticism much more strongly if what they most needed was recognition. In another setting, a teacher may believe they are giving helpful coaching while the student hears a harsh verdict on ability. The book teaches that receiving feedback well begins with knowing what kind of feedback is actually being offered. Without that clarity, we respond to the wrong problem. What looks like overreaction may actually be unmet need, and what looks like rejection may actually be confusion. This framework is simple, but it immediately deepens how we understand so many difficult conversations. The authors argue that feedback becomes difficult not only because of what is said, but because of what it triggers in us. They identify 3 broad categories of triggers: truth triggers, relationship triggers, and identity triggers. These 3 ideas are among the most helpful in the book because they explain why feedback can feel emotionally charged even when the words themselves seem manageable. Truth triggers occur when the feedback strikes us as wrong, unfair, exaggerated, uninformed, or simply unhelpful. Our immediate response is to reject it because the content itself feels flawed. Relationship triggers happen when our reaction is shaped by who is giving the feedback. We may dislike the person, distrust their motives, resent their hypocrisy, or feel entangled in a history that makes the message hard to separate from the messenger. Identity triggers are the deepest. These happen when feedback threatens the way we see ourselves. If I think of myself as competent, generous, thoughtful, or capable, then feedback suggesting otherwise can feel destabilizing. What makes this framework so powerful is that it normalizes our defensiveness without excusing it. It helps us see that resistance is often not random. It follows patterns. Once you can name the kind of trigger that is active, you gain some distance from it. Instead of simply feeling overwhelmed, you can begin to ask, what exactly is bothering me here? Is this feedback touching a fairness concern, a relationship issue, or a threat to my self-image? That question creates room for reflection. The authors do not say that triggers are bad. They are information. They tell us where the heat is. But if we do not understand them, they quickly take over. We stop listening, start arguing, or collapse internally. Recognizing triggers is therefore one of the first steps toward receiving feedback with more steadiness and intelligence. Truth triggers are often the most obvious. Someone tells us that we were careless, insensitive, disorganized, too passive, too controlling, or ineffective in some way, and our mind immediately begins building a case. That is not accurate. They do not understand the situation. They are ignoring context. They have oversimplified what happened. They are seeing one moment and treating it like a pattern. In many cases, some of that may be true. One of the refreshing things about this book is that it does not pretend all feedback is wise. People can be biased, careless, inconsistent, and poorly informed. Their observations can be partial or distorted. But the authors also warn that immediate rejection can keep us from learning something important. Even feedback that is clumsily delivered may contain a signal worth examining. Perhaps the person's interpretation is wrong, but their experience is real. Perhaps their standard is flawed, but their reaction reveals how others may also perceive us. Perhaps they are exaggerating, but not inventing. The challenge, then, is not to decide instantly whether the feedback is entirely right or entirely wrong. It is to become more discerning. What part of this is fact? What part is interpretation? What context am I tempted to use only as self-defense? What data is missing? What might still be useful, even if the message is incomplete? This is difficult because truth triggers invite us into a courtroom mindset. We become lawyers defending ourselves rather than learners examining information. The book asks us to do something more demanding. Stay open long enough to sort the feedback instead of dismissing it whole. This does not mean surrender. It means analysis. It means being willing to admit that an imperfect message can still carry insight, and that being misunderstood in part does not mean there is nothing to understand. Sometimes what makes feedback hard is not the content, but the person delivering it. The same observation can feel constructive from one source and infuriating from another. This is the territory of relationship triggers. Maybe the person giving feedback has their own obvious blind spots. Maybe they have hurt us before. Maybe they speak from a position of authority that feels unfair. Maybe we simply do not trust them. Under these conditions, feedback becomes entangled with history, power, hypocrisy, or resentment. We do not hear only the message. We hear everything attached to the messenger. This is profoundly human. We are not abstract information processors. We receive meaning through relationship. If someone we dislike says we are dismissive, our mind may immediately reply, "And you are arrogant." If someone who never supports us offers criticism, we may feel the imbalance more than the content. The book does not ask us to pretend these dynamics do not matter. It acknowledges that they matter deeply. At the same time, it urges us to separate, as much as possible, the question of whether the person has flaws from the question of whether their observation contains something worth considering. This is hard because hypocrisy is especially triggering. We resist being corrected by people who seem guilty of the same thing. Yet even hypocrites can notice something true. The authors want us to see that rejecting feedback on the basis of the relationship may protect pride, but it can also block learning. The mature move is not to ignore the relationship dynamic, but to name it if necessary and still remain curious about the content. What part of my reaction belongs to the message, and what part belongs to the history between us? That question alone can create space where defensiveness would otherwise take over. Identity triggers go deeper than disagreement or distrust. They touch the structure of self. If you believe you are competent, responsible, thoughtful, ethical, or talented, then feedback that challenges those traits can feel like a threat to your very stability. A small comment can suddenly feel enormous because it collides with a core self-image. This is why feedback is often not received as simple information. It is received as a test. Am I who I thought I was? Am I failing in a way that says something fundamental about me? The authors argue that identity triggers are especially powerful because most people have a fragile relationship with imperfection. They want to believe they are good and capable, and feedback that complicates that story can feel like humiliation or collapse. But the book offers a wiser view of identity. It suggests that becoming better at receiving feedback requires building a more flexible and grounded sense of self. You are not all good or all bad. You are not one performance review, one comment, one mistake, or one person's opinion. You are a complex human being with strengths, limits, contradictions, and blind spots. If your identity can hold that complexity, feedback becomes less threatening. You may still feel discomfort, but you are less likely to panic or become consumed by self-protection. This is one of the book's deepest contributions because it turns the feedback problem inward in a healthy way. The issue is not only how others speak to us. It is also how rigidly we are trying to preserve a self-image that cannot tolerate challenge. Growth becomes possible when feedback no longer has to be either total truth or total destruction. It can simply be information, sometimes useful, sometimes partial, always worth sorting, but not equal to your worth. A major shift the book encourages is moving away from the question, is this feedback right or wrong, and toward the question, what can I learn from this? That change may seem subtle, but it alters the whole posture of receiving. The right or wrong question tends to produce defensiveness because it frames feedback like a verdict. If I can prove it wrong, I am safe. If it is right, I am threatened. But learning is a broader and more useful aim. Even feedback that is overstated, unfair, or incomplete may still contain information. It may tell me how I come across under pressure. It may reveal a mismatch in expectations. It may uncover a blind spot or identify a recurring pattern in how my behavior is experienced. The learning question also makes room for different kinds of truth. There is factual truth, yes, but there is also impact. Someone may misread my intention and still be accurately describing their experience of me. That matters. Or someone may be evaluating me by a standard I do not share, which does not automatically make either of us irrational. Again, that matters. The book wants us to become more nuanced in how we interpret input. Not because truth is relative in some vague sense, but because human interaction is layered. If we only ask whether the other person is correct in the narrowest possible way, we miss what their reaction might reveal. The learning mindset does not mean accepting every criticism. It means becoming less brittle, less binary, and more curious. It means saying, perhaps this is not the whole truth, but there may still be something here worth understanding. That posture transforms feedback from a courtroom into a classroom. The distinction between appreciation, coaching, and evaluation becomes especially powerful when we apply it to everyday life. Consider work. An employee may be working hard, stretching themselves, and feeling unseen. If the manager keeps offering only suggestions for improvement, the employee may become demoralized, not because they reject development, but because their need for appreciation is unmet. In another case, someone may crave clear evaluation. They want to know where they stand, whether they are meeting expectations, and what the consequences are. Instead, they receive vague positivity that leaves them uncertain. Or think about parenting. A child may need appreciation for effort, but instead hears only correction. A teenager may need coaching, but hear every comment as a valuation of worth. In close relationships, the confusion can be just as strong. One partner says, "I wish you would communicate earlier when plans change," intending coaching. The other hears, "You're inconsiderate," and experiences it as evaluation. The book helps us understand that not all pain in feedback conversations comes from fragility. Sometimes it comes from category confusion. We're answering one question while the other person is asking another. Once you can distinguish the three forms, you become better at both receiving and seeking input. You can ask, "Is this feedback about how I am doing, how to improve, or whether my contribution is valued?" You can also notice when you need one kind of input but are receiving another. This clarity is immensely practical because it reduces emotional fog. It also reveals that many so-called feedback problems are actually failures of fit between the kind of message delivered and the kind of message needed. One reason feedback matters so much is that self-perception is limited. We all have blind spots. We cannot fully see our tone, our habits, our interpersonal patterns, our impact in groups, or the gap between intention and effect. We may think we are being direct when others experience us as harsh. We may think we are being calm when others experience us as distant. We may think we are being helpful when others experience us as controlling. These blind spots are difficult precisely because they are invisible from the inside. This is why external feedback, even when uncomfortable, is one of the few ways to access parts of ourselves we would otherwise miss. The book treats this with both seriousness and care. It does not suggest that others see us perfectly. Other people have their own blind spots, preferences, and distortions. But repeated feedback across time and sources can help us detect patterns. If several people mention the same issue, that deserves attention. If feedback recurs in different settings, it may point to a real tendency rather than an isolated misunderstanding. The authors encourage us to compare input, look for themes, and treat others' perceptions as data rather than absolute truth. This is a balanced view. It protects against both arrogance and overcompliance. You are not transparent to yourself, but neither are others infallible. The goal is not to surrender your self-understanding. It is to expand it. And that expansion often requires humility, because blind spots are rarely flattering. Yet they are also one of the richest sources of growth. What we cannot see, we cannot change. Feedback gives us a mirror, imperfect, but often useful, and learning to look into that mirror without either vanity or self-hatred is one of the central arts this book teaches. A subtle but liberating idea in the book is that feedback does not always point to a defect. Sometimes it points to a difference. This is an important distinction because many people hear criticism and immediately assume that something is wrong with them in a moral or personal sense. But often the issue is a mismatch of style, preference, expectations, or values. One manager may value assertiveness, while another values restraint. One partner may want frequent verbal reassurance, while another assumes care is shown through actions. One colleague may experience fast decision-making as confidence, while another experiences it as recklessness. In these situations, feedback is not necessarily revealing a universal flaw. It may be revealing a clash between two reasonable but different approaches. The book encourages us to ask whether the issue is about right and wrong, or about fit, preference, and context. This matters because it changes the emotional tone of feedback dramatically. If I interpret every difference as evidence that I am deficient, then receiving input becomes shaming. But if I can recognize that some feedback is about differing styles or environments, then I can respond with more flexibility. I may still choose to adapt. In fact, adaptation may be wise and generous. But adaptation is easier when it is not confused with self-condemnation. This perspective also helps us avoid turning others into authorities over our identity. They're offering a perspective shaped by their context, needs, and standards. That perspective may be useful. It may even be important. But it does not automatically define who we are. Difference, then, becomes an area for negotiation and learning, not just judgment. The book makes clear that receiving feedback well is not a passive act. It is an active skill, and part of that skill is learning to ask better questions. When feedback is vague, emotionally loaded, or confusing, the worst responses are often immediate defense or silent compliance. A much better response is inquiry. What specifically did you notice? Can you give me an example? Was this a one-time issue or a pattern? What impact did it have on you or the team? What would you like to see instead? These questions do several things at once. They move the conversation from judgment to detail. They help distinguish behavior from interpretation. They clarify whether the issue is serious, recurring, contextual, or ambiguous. Most importantly, they turn the feedback conversation into a collaborative effort to understand rather than a one-sided declaration. This is especially useful when the feedback feels unfair. Specifics often reveal whether the other person is identifying a real pattern or reacting to a narrow moment. They also help the receiver stay engaged without surrendering judgment. The authors want us to become skillful participants in feedback conversations, not merely targets of them. That means asking questions not only to defend ourselves, but to make the message more usable. It means being willing to say, "Help me understand what you mean by that," rather than reacting only to the emotional sting of the words. Inquiry is powerful because it slows down reactivity and makes room for clarity. In many cases, asking a thoughtful question is the moment that transforms a painful exchange into a productive one. A comforting and realistic feature of the book is that it does not ask readers to become emotionally unaffected by feedback. That would be unrealistic and, in many ways, undesirable. Feedback often touches things that matter deeply: competence, belonging, trust, fairness, and identity. Of course, it evokes feeling. Embarrassment, irritation, anger, sadness, confusion, and shame are not signs that you are failing to receive feedback well. They are signs that something meaningful has been touched. The question is, what happens next? Do the emotions take complete control, or can they be noticed, named, and held long enough for reflection to occur? The authors encourage exactly this kind of emotional steadiness. They do not promise instant composure. Instead, they suggest slowing down, postponing final judgment, and recognizing that first reactions are often not the full story. This matters because many feedback conversations go badly not because the original message was catastrophic, but because the emotional aftershock drives escalation. We react before sorting. We defend before understanding. Or we spiral inward and turn a specific comment into a sweeping verdict about our worth. The book offers a more grounded alternative. Feel what you feel, but do not treat the feeling as the final meaning of the feedback. Strong emotion may indicate a trigger, an old insecurity, a misunderstood message, or a genuinely important issue. In any case, time and reflection help. This emotional realism is one of the reasons the book feels compassionate rather than harsh. It respects the difficulty of feedback while still insisting that difficulty can be managed with practice. Sometimes feedback lands with unusual force because it confirms a fear we already carry. A person who privately worries they are not capable enough may experience ordinary coaching as proof of failure. Someone who fears being selfish may take a single relational complaint as confirmation that they are deeply flawed. Someone who has long feared rejection may hear evaluation as a sign that they do not belong. In these moments, the reaction is not only about the current comment. It is about a much older narrative. The book helps readers see this without shame. Our responses are shaped by history, temperament, memory, and unresolved self-doubt. Feedback often awakens those layers. This insight is useful because it helps us respond more wisely. If I know that a particular kind of comment reliably destabilizes me, I can prepare for that reaction instead of being ruled by it. I can say to myself, this feedback may matter, but it is also touching an old bruise. I do not need to decide everything about myself in this moment. That kind of self-awareness creates emotional breathing room. It allows the receiver to separate the present issue from the entire story of the self. This is not avoidance. It is proportion. And proportion is one of the great gifts the book tries to cultivate. The authors also emphasize that people are not limited to receiving whatever feedback happens to come their way. They can ask for it, shape it, and direct it more usefully. Asking for feedback well means avoiding questions so broad that they invite vagueness or reassurance. Instead of asking, "Do you have any feedback for me?" it is often better to ask something more specific. What is one thing I could do differently in meetings to be more effective? When I explained that project, what was clear and what was confusing? How do I come across when I disagree? These kinds of questions invite concrete observations rather than general impressions. They also make it easier for others to be honest, because the request feels manageable and focused. Asking for feedback can be uncomfortable because it means inviting information that may unsettle us. But it also creates agency. We become participants in our learning rather than passive recipients of occasional criticism. The book shows that this proactive stance can improve not only personal growth, but also the culture around us. People become more candid when they see that candor is welcomed and handled thoughtfully. At the same time, asking for feedback does not mean surrendering boundaries. You can ask for input in areas you are genuinely ready to explore. You can decide who is likely to offer thoughtful perspective. You can request examples and clarification. The larger message is that feedback is not just something that happens to us. It is something we can engage with more deliberately, intelligently, and strategically. One of the book's deepest and quietest arguments is that self-acceptance and learning are not enemies. In fact, real learning often depends on a deeper kind of self-acceptance. If your worth feels constantly on trial, feedback becomes unbearable. Every criticism becomes a threat. Every suggestion feels like insufficiency, and every evaluation becomes a referendum on who you are. Under those conditions, defensiveness makes perfect sense. But if you are more securely grounded, if you can say, "I am imperfect and still worthy," then feedback becomes easier to receive. It may still sting. It may still be inconvenient, inaccurate in parts, or emotionally difficult. But it no longer has to decide your value. This frees up attention for what really matters. What, if anything, should I take from this? The authors are not arguing for complacency. They are arguing for resilience. The resilient person can hear something hard without being shattered by it. They can acknowledge weakness without turning it into self-hatred. They can improve because they do not have to deny every flaw to survive psychologically. This is one of the most mature ideas in the book because it shifts the question from technique alone to inner stability. Receiving feedback well is not just about having the right phrases or asking the right questions. It is about building a self that can remain open in the presence of discomfort. That kind of openness is rare, but it is transformative. In the end, thanks for the feedback is about more than feedback. It is about the kind of person we become when information about ourselves is difficult to hear. Do we harden into defensiveness? Do we collapse into shame? Do we chase approval and lose our own center? Or do we learn the harder art of staying open, discerning, and steady? The book's answer is not that we should accept every opinion or enjoy criticism. It is that we can become more skillful at sorting. We can recognize what kind of feedback is being offered. We can notice our triggers instead of obeying them blindly. We can ask better questions, separate fact from interpretation, and look for learning even in messy messages. We can build identities strong enough to tolerate correction and humble enough to keep growing. That is the deeper invitation of the book. To become teachable without becoming fragile. To remain self-respecting without becoming closed. To receive feedback not as a final judgment, but as part of the ongoing work of understanding who we are and how we affect the world around us. This is not easy. It requires humility, patience, self-awareness, and emotional discipline. But it changes everything. It makes learning richer, relationships more honest, and growth more possible. Because in the end, the question is not whether feedback will come. It always will. The question is whether we can meet it in a way that helps us become wiser rather than merely more defended.